and talk more as we go along. Okay, so let me see here, make sure everything's running smoothly. And let's see if we can jump right into Lightroom. Sweet. Here we go. All right, so we're in Lightroom, and if it looks a little different, that's because I've already clicked the Create Mask tool. So often you'll see something like this. Nice. So down here about the fourth icon, you're going to find the masking tool. So if you come from applications like Photoshop, you're probably fairly familiar with masking tools, but we haven't really had that power within Lightroom. So this is fairly new, but more importantly, it's very automatic. So it's really just machine learning, recognizing different items within your image to be able to detect what is a background, what is a person, for example, what is a subject or an object, if it's object photography, product photography that you're bringing in here. So really, really cool to be able to use these tools. Let me see. All right, so let's go in here, and I think I'm gonna start with this one. This was our cover. So if you guys were with the holiday live streams yesterday, you probably are familiar with this shot. We're gonna go in here and play with masking tools just to get a little bit more of control on how many things you can do if you're, for example, like me, shooting some in-studio photography. I have this set up in my house actually, so it was kind of fun. This is the day we set up the backdrops. So one of the things about having backdrops is that backdrops can get really expensive, right? If you know about that. So I'm going to go in here and select background. And that was, did you even see that? That was so fast. Now, sometimes it's not absolutely accurate. So I'm going to hit subtract here, and I'm going to go and select a different type of option. So we have objects, brush, linear gradients. I remember the first time I saw this, it confused me a little bit. The best thing to do if you're going to subtract is just to select brush, right? So that gives me a brush. We're still in the same mask. We're just going to modify it a little bit. So I noticed my cat was selected along this. You can see because it's a bit red, and that is the mask showing. So I'm going to erase that, right? Because we don't want that to show. And if you don't see the mask, you can always hit O, and you can see that red section being selected. Yeah, I don't want my cat to change in color in the way that I'm going to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this color palette, this color on that yellow. So I selected yellow because I really love the way that pops and it looks great with my skin. I'm going to be doing some portraiture. So I wanted to select that, but I still want to have the opportunity to modify this backdrop whenever I need to. So that's something that you might want to keep in mind if you're buying a backdrop. So I'm going to go down here and under color. And under color, you can see I can already change sort of the temperature of that hue, right? So it's lighter, it's more vibrant. I can change it to a little bit greener, but that doesn't quite change the background color. So what I'm going to do is go into colorize, and colorize is going to give me even more options. So we have, so let's go here. So I can go into green, and that completely changed that color of my backdrop, and I didn't have to spend a dime on it, right? So we have these post-production resources to be able to modify and use our resources a little bit more smart, right? So this is just selecting the background. Okay, so we have that option there. I think I'm happy with that. That looks good. My cat didn't change colors. Awesome. That's looking great. So I'm going to add another mask here. And I think this time I'm going to select a subject, but let's try it on a different image. Okay, I'm going to do it on this one. Okay. So again, we have objects, brush, linear gradients. I love using linear gradients. And what's really cool is that when you go over any of these tools, it gives you this little insider of how it works. So it's definitely a matter of you taking a little bit of time and going in here. And obviously what you're doing right now is probably perfect because you're learning alongside me and many other folks. So this is going to be able to help you just get an insight of how to use the tool. Radial gradient, for example, is basically a circle. So it acts a lot. I love using this when I want to do maybe a vignette. So I want to do a manual vignette, or maybe I want to change the colors of the outside area. So I can do this, and I can go in here and go into the light section and just brighten that exposure, right? And that is specific to, or darken that exposure, and that is specific to that circle. Now, I don't want it to be in the center, so I'm actually going to invert it and hit Command I, or just click on the three dots there, and that inverts that selection. So now it's the outer area, and that's a cool way to just create a vignette around a portrait, right? So that is the darker area, and it creates a simulation of a spotlight, I would say if you actually had your lights doing this, but this is post-production, so you get to do it in post just as well and not have to spend a lot of money on really crazy lights. So there's different ways to do it. Of course, I did it very exaggerated, but you can definitely play around and see how you can add this element. It's just a little subtle effect here. But what's cool about this is that you get to choose where the spotlight lands. So that's different from using that vignette tool within, I believe in our effects, we have a vignette tool. I think it's in details. Yeah, so you're able to change that outer layer, but here you actually can select a spot. So in fact, if you did have product photography, this is a great way to just put a spotlight on that particular product. And I think that's really cool. Awesome. So we have that option there on our masking tool, one that I use quite frequently, especially for portraits. But I'm going to add something else here. So I'm going to go into subject selection. And again, it's kind of wild how quickly these selections are made. I mean, I used to do this often in Photoshop, and I think before machine learning, AI was possible within our Adobe Creative Cloud. You know, you often had to go brush in a lot of those elements, but this is a very readily quick option for you to just select the people in your frame without having to worry about whether it is, you know, kind of time consuming, right? So I do have a bit of a challenge here. I do have my curly hair involved. So that's something to consider. I do have like little strands, things like that. There's so many really cool solutions to that actually, but I'm not going to worry too much about this. This was actually a fair selection. Those strands that are on the outside can stay off. So I'm going to go into this little guy here. It's a, or woman actually, because it's me. So it says person one. And when you click here, again, this is very brand new feature. So when you click into this, I love this feature. You're able to go into different sections of that selection. So it selected the entire person, but it also selected the face. It also selected the body, the eyebrows. So if you wanted to go in here and adjust maybe the highlights or the shadows within your eyes so that it stands out a little bit more, I often find myself doing that if in case I didn't get that focus directly on an eye, right? I get to do this and it really accentuates the look altogether. Let's see if I can show you an example of something I did just to explore here. So this, I think, is a really good example of me using that tool as well. So let's see, let's go in here. right? So this is an example of what you would do. So you can see there the eyes are so pronounced and they're so beautiful, right? But that definitely, although the highlights were there and the shadows were there, by using that masking tool, I was able to really focus in on the eyes and I really highlight the highlights and enunciate those shadows. So that's sort of what I like to use that for, whenever I don't have I have that focus on the eye, or I miss the focus on the eye, but I want to accentuate it. So that's the eye selection here. We also have the iris. So the eye selection, you can brighten up those eyes, the lips. So the lips are kind of fun to do. So I'm going to select the lips here just to have a little fun in this stream. So I'm going to go into the color section. So say, for example, you wanted to colorize or add a little bit more hue or more coloration to your or tint to your lips. You can definitely do that. You can just like subtly change that tint. It's so accurate, and honestly, you can still see a lot of the texture beneath, which is the value of masking, right? You don't lose that image, and it's always sort of non-destructive, right? So if I wanted to change it again, much like the backdrop, we can colorize and we can change it to blue lips. Oh my god, I've never wore blue lipstick before. I think that kind of looks a little bit more purple, but hey, that looks pretty cool. So if I had a photo shoot with a model and maybe we totally forgot that in fact part of the brief was to involve a certain color palette, we can go in here and just create a subtle tint to be able to change it up. And sometimes it's not even about that. It might just be a matter of just introducing a little bit more color here. I'm actually not gonna keep that one because it looks a little bit too wild for me, but I think a little color works. Awesome. So that was just adding the lips by recognizing the subject in my image. So I'm going to do that again, but this time I'm going to select, for example, the hair. So let's go and select the hair on this one. Let's see how that looks. So I've always, but I never like dyeing my hair, but I've always been very in love with folks who dye their hair like different colors, very cool. And so it's kind of nice to be able to sort of go in here and switch it up. So a little bit of blue hue still feels like my black hair, which I love. Or if you wanted to switch it up and just kind of warm up those tones in the backdrop so that they blend with your background, that's another reason why I would do this. There's just so many different things. Obviously, someone has lighter hair. I think a color implementation is a little bit easier than if they had dark hair, but you can just start to see some of those possibilities. I'm going to keep that blue because it's kind of cool. I've never seen my hair blue like that. All right, so let's go back into persons here and see if we can select a different item. So if I was to select, for example, the eyes, let's go into the eyes since we talked about this. I can see that because my hair is in the way, it was creating a bit of shadow. So my eyes don't look as bright as they could. So I would go then into, I've selected the eyes here. It looks really wild with the blue, with the red, but I'm gonna go here into light and just bring up the whites just a little bit. And that's gonna help in modifying that. And I think that's really cool because that's something that you always want to kind of have readily available whenever you're playing with post editing. You want to have those opportunities to bring in different situations into your scene that maybe you weren't able to do during pre-production, which I think is important. So I'm going to go here into a different bulk of my photos just to demonstrate a different gradient here. One of my favorite gradients, let's reset this image. So one of my favorite gradient tools is the linear gradient because you can do just so much on things like this. So let's go in here and play around with the linear gradient. So I'm gonna go into linear gradient and you can see the example here on the right hand side. Cool, that looks awesome. I know that I can use it vertically or horizontally, right? The horizon, horizontally. So I think I'm gonna go in here and hit like a vertical just to bring in a bit more dimension to that sky, just to see how I can change it a little bit. So you can see how that affects just that particular area, and that alone just starts to give it a little bit more dimension. This was an image taken, actually I think the series alone is images taken with my phone, and I love going in here. The phone is can be very flat. I know they've introduced effects to make it look like it has a certain f-stop and it has that depth, but I like the fact that everything's in focus, but with a bit of tonality, I can bring in a little bit of depth. It's a sort of an illusion in itself, right? So that's a really cool way. I can also invert it, and that can switch around. You can turn this around and just start to play around with where is it coming from, right? One of the things I like to use this linear mask for, I'm going to go in here and add another linear mask, but this time I'm going to do it vertically in this way. And instead of affecting the exposure, I'm actually going to go into color, and I'm going to introduce a color in here. So there's a bit of a pattern going on here. We've been using colorize. So if I want to use colorize, I can go and pretend to create a film leak, right? Light leak. And that starts to give those really cool effects. I love when things look like this, because this could easily be animated. And when I see things like this, by the way, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, as many of you are. So I always start to think of other spaces that I can bring my photos in to bring it to life a little bit more. So sometimes it doesn't end there, right? So I can export an image like this, then I can export an image with a purple, and then one with a little bit of blue, and then put it together in Photoshop, in the animation in Photoshop, or whichever animation application you like the most, After Effects, and just create this effect, right? If you can see it being possible here, then you can definitely create it. But that's so beautiful. I love that we just made it a bit more nostalgic, right? This is a scene from Calle Ocho in Little Havana in Miami, Florida. And I love the authenticity of that neighborhood. Is a refuge for a lot of Cuban immigrants, and I love seeing the flavor that they bring into the city, to the environment, the food. So of course I love bringing in a little nostalgia to that. I think it's a good fit. So let's go into, for example, New York, and see how we can use some of our gradients to play around here. So I have also color range, luminance range, as a masking tool. There's a lot of control here, right? So I can go in here and select color range. And if I select something like the sky, right? We do have that background selection, so there's that. But anything like this color blue, it's going to select it, right? Blues and reds are really easy to find within your image, right? The reds are a little trickier because they exist within skins, so you have to be a little bit more careful, but I think we can have a lot more fun with this one because this is the iron building. I mean, it's been there forever, right? So why not kind of take it to the past and remove that saturation maybe a little bit, and you can start to see that we don't lose all the colors, but we're affecting all the blues there. I can't help myself. I have to crop this because it is not straight. There you go. So let's go back into our mask there, and there it is, right? We still have our mask. We don't have to worry about losing our edits in this mask, so that's super awesome. Let's see if we can play around with color range in this image. All right, let's go into color range again, go into this section, and if I select, for example, this hue, now that's selecting the greens, right? So I'm gonna go in here and decide, actually I want those greens to pop a little bit more. I want the tints to be a little bit different. I don't want the green to be too blue because I have so much blue going on here in the background. So I can actually modify that. Or I want to desaturate it. That's a great thing to do. I know I'm using the green plants to frame this image, to frame the architecture here, but maybe I don't want it to take up too much of the attention. I want to desaturate it so that eye just travels directly to the architecture. So that's another way of thinking it. All right, really cool. And the thing is that you can always then go in here, and in the same way that we were able to subtract, we can also add to this image. So I can see here this color wasn't included, so I can add another color range and select maybe this item here, right? And that selects that, or select this item, the blue in the background. So we've decided to desaturate. So because we're adding to that mask, it's going to affect it in the same way that you've decided to change the previous mask, right? Because it's still living almost as a group within the same mask. So if you decide to desaturate it, then the next selection that you add onto it is going to take those effects too. So that's something to think about as you go along. Let's jump into another photo here and see what we can do to this one. So within the range, you can also select specifics to luminance, right? So what is brightest? So it's not just specific to objects, backgrounds, and color. You can also select, say, oh, I noticed that I overblew the highlights here a little bit. So let's go and select those highlights. So I'm going to click on those particular highlights, and it really showed up all over the image. And that's something that comes with using phones. Even in video photography, you can tell that it's a phone because the highlights are always blown out, right? So like one day that's going to be such a particular characteristic of phone photography, right? One day we'll look at it and be like, wow, this is precious. This belongs in a museum. But for now, if we want to adjust it and we want to make it feel a little bit more like I took it with a regular camera, or just improve it in post, which is what we always have the goal to do, right? I'm going to go into this mask that I did with the luminance, and you can see the luminance here, right? Okay, so then I can see this, and I can see all of the different light selections that I was able to pick. I can scroll this over to select the shadows if I want to, right? And you can see how that changes. I wanted to select all the things that were blown out, so I can go in here and actually lower that in my light panel. Right, so I can lower that, and that strengthens the color a little bit. Let's add another color luminance to this, because I think, another luminance range, because I love the way it was able to select those shadows. And I love adding a little color to shadows. So we're gonna go into color and add a little bit of that temperature just to make it, it doesn't have to be completely black, right? So let's give it a little bit of color here. And if you look at film photography, a lot of these films often have a little brown, a little green into their shadows. So that's a really nice way to just colorize your image without having to only affect the things that have color in them. You can also affect the shadows and bring in a little bit of hue in there too. So you can see there what that looks like. Oops, a little bit of a strobe there, just so that we can get into that mode, that energetic mode. Okay, so then you can see how cool that looks, right? Like that alone gives it a little bit more balance, and my highlights and my shadows have a little bit more color. And I'm going to continue this and actually go and affect this hue up here and make it a little darker with my target selection tool. And also in my target selection tool, I want to affect the hue to make it a little bit blue. That's so beautiful, right? And this is a phone photo. That's wild to think about, right? Let's see if I go into my masks and add a linear gradient and add that really cool film leak that I created earlier, I think that's gonna make it look even more awesome. And of course, we added blue, so I feel like the green is a little too striking, and so that highlight here on the left hand side gets to have a bit of color. And so that's how we had it before, and that's how we made it after. And mind you that the whole goal of this is to consider your options in terms of like just being able to make edits based on micro selections, right? The more you are making these post editing workflows based on specifics, right? I'm selecting highlights, I'm selecting specific colors, I'm selecting specific shadows, I am selecting a specific part of my subject, right? Here, this one. So I'm selecting the different parts of my subject. That gives you that control that you really ultimately want, right? To be able to make these edits to work for you, as opposed to just adding a grand, like, you know, the word filter is pretty funny because the word filter really just feels like an entire sheet on top of your image that just affects everything globally. And this way, you're being more precise, you're taking care of the smaller details. And sometimes you even get the opportunity to modify some things that as artists on a budget, we gotta be able to kind of find those post-production tricks and pro tips, in this case, tips and tricks, you know, of the trade to be able to have more options.